December 15th, 1944, the Ardennes Forest, Belgium. Corporal James Washington hunched over a makeshift surgical table in a freezing aid station, watching frost form on the canvas walls as another wounded soldier was carried through the entrance. The temperature had plummeted to 15 degrees below zero, and the medic knew exactly what that meant. In his 8 months treating casualties across Europe, he had learned that cold weather and battlefield wounds created the perfect conditions for one of a soldier's worst enemies, an invisible killer that worked faster than any weapon. The men around him believed the antibiotics would arrive any day now, that headquarters understood the desperate situation at the front, that modern military medicine would save them all. Outside, the sound of distant artillery rolled through the forest like thunder that would not end, punctuated by the closer crack of small arms fire as patrols clashed in the snowy darkness. Before we dive into this story, make sure to subscribe to the channel and tell me in the comments where you are watching from. It really helps support the channel. What none of them realized was that within 72 hours, James Washington would abandon everything he had learned in medical training and turn to a remedy that would have him court-martialed if discovered, a solution born from memories of his grandfather's farm in rural Alabama, a mixture so unorthodox that it would challenge every principle of military medicine, yet save more lives than all the regulation supplies combined. This is the story of how traditional wisdom, modern training, and desperate courage converged in one of the most unlikely medical breakthroughs of the Second World War, a breakthrough that military authorities would try to forget, but that the men who survived would remember for the rest of their lives. James Washington had grown up in Tuskegee, Alabama, the youngest of 7 children in a family that had worked the same red clay soil for 3 generations. His grandfather, Samuel Washington, had been born into slavery in 1858 on a plantation outside Montgomery, and lived to see his great-grandchildren attend college, including James, who had been the first in the family to pursue higher education. The old man had possessed a knowledge of healing that came from necessity, from decades when black families could not access white doctors, when remedies had to be created from whatever the land provided, when the choice was between folk medicine and watching loved ones die. Samuel had learned from his own mother, who had learned from hers, creating an unbroken chain of knowledge stretching back generations. Young James would sit on the porch steps of the old farmhouse, watching Samuel mix poultices and tinctures, listening to explanations delivered in a voice worn smooth by 90 years of living. The porch overlooked fields that stretched to a pine forest in the distance, the same trees that would one day, in a roundabout way, save lives thousands of miles away in Belgium. Samuel's hands, gnarled by arthritis and decades of farm labor, moved with surprising delicacy as he prepared his remedies, grinding herbs with a mortar and pestle that had belonged to his mother, measuring by feel and experience rather than written formula. One lesson had stayed with James more than any other. It was the summer of 1933, and a neighbor's son, a boy named Thomas Jenkins, had cut his leg badly on rusted farm equipment. The wound had become infected, red lines creeping up the boy's thigh like angry rivers on a map, fever climbing dangerously high. The family had no money for a doctor, and even if they had, the nearest white doctor who would treat black patients was 30 miles away over roads that became impassable mud after any rain. Thomas's father, Samuel Jenkins, had come to the Washington farm in desperation, carrying his son who was barely conscious with fever. James, then 12 years old, had watched his grandfather do something that seemed impossible. Samuel had taken white lightning, the illegal corn whiskey that some farmers made in hidden stills deep in the woods, mixed it with crushed herbs from the garden, garlic and yarrow and plants whose names James had not yet learned, boiled pine resin until it formed a sticky paste, and applied the combination to the infected wound. The boy had screamed at first, the alcohol burning in the damaged tissue, but Samuel had held firm, wrapping the leg and instructing the father to change the dressing twice daily. Within 3 days the infection had cleared, the red lines faded, the fever broke. The boy lived, and years later, Thomas Jenkins would enlist in the army himself, serving in the Pacific Theater, never knowing that his childhood injury had taught a future medic a lesson that would save dozens of lives. When James asked how it worked, His grandfather had explained in simple terms that a 12-year-old could understand. The alcohol killed the bad things trying to eat the flesh. The herbs reduced the swelling and pain. The pine resin created a seal that kept new bad things out while letting the wound breathe just enough. It was not magic, Samuel had said, just understanding what each ingredient could do and combining them properly, the same way you would not plant corn without preparing the soil, or expect butter without churning cream. But he had also warned James never to tell white doctors about such remedies. They would not understand, would not believe that an uneducated black man could know something they did not. Might even accuse Samuel of practicing medicine without a license, a charge that could land him in jail or worse. That conversation had planted seeds in young James's mind, seeds that would germinate slowly over the years. His grandfather possessed real knowledge, knowledge that worked, knowledge that saved lives. Yet that knowledge was dismissed, ignored, or actively suppressed by the very people who claimed to be experts in healing. The contradiction bothered James deeply. How could something be both effective and illegitimate? How could his grandfather be both healer and criminal for practicing the same art? These questions drove James toward education. If he could learn the white man's medicine, understand it from the inside, perhaps he could bridge the gap between Samuel's empirical wisdom and modern medical science. Perhaps he could validate what his grandfather knew through the language of chemistry and biology, prove that the old ways were not superstition, but practical knowledge waiting to be understood properly. 10 years later, James Washington enlisted in the Army. He had completed 2 years of college at Tuskegee Institute, studying biology with dreams of becoming a doctor, but the war had interrupted everything. The military, desperate for medical personnel, trained him as a combat medic and assigned him to the 922 Quartermaster Service Company, a segregated unit tasked with supporting frontline operations. He spent 6 months treating everything from trench foot to shrapnel wounds, learning that battlefield medicine was less about sophisticated techniques and more about keeping men alive long enough to reach a real hospital. The Ardennes offensive had changed everything. The German military's surprise attack through the forest had caught Allied forces completely unprepared. Supply lines were cut. Communication broke down. Medical supplies, always in short supply at the front, became almost non-existent. James found himself treating more casualties than ever before, with fewer resources than he had started with. The real problem was not the immediate wounds. Shrapnel injuries, broken bones, even bullet wounds could be stabilized if you worked fast. The killer was what came after, the infections that bloomed in damaged tissue, turning survivable injuries into death sentences. In the warmth of summer, infections progressed slowly, giving time for evacuation to field hospitals. But in the brutal cold of the Ardennes winter, something different was happening. Staff Sergeant Thomas Miller was the first case James could not ignore. Miller, a 32-year-old farmer from Cedar Rapids, Iowa, had taken shrapnel in his left calf 3 days earlier, a wound that should have healed cleanly with proper treatment. The injury had occurred during a patrol that ran into an enemy position. Miller had been helping evacuate wounded men when a mortar round landed too close, sending fragments of hot metal in all directions. One piece, no larger than a man's thumbnail, had punched through his boot and buried itself in the muscle of his calf. James had extracted the shrapnel, cleaned the wound as thoroughly as possible with the limited antiseptic available, and bandaged it carefully. Miller had been mobile afterward, limping but functional, helping around the aid station while waiting for orders to evacuate to a hospital in the rear. That had been the plan. Evacuate within 24 hours, get proper treatment, heal up, and return to duty in a month or two. But the German offensive had destroyed that plan along with everything else. When James unwrapped the bandage on the morning of December 16th, 72 hours after the initial injury, the smell hit him before he saw the damage. It was a particular odor that every medic learned to recognize and dread, the smell of tissue dying, of bacteria producing gas as they consumed flesh, a smell that was somehow both sweet and putrid, like rotten fruit mixed with decay. The flesh around the wound had turned grey-green, spreading up toward the knee in a pattern that looked almost like frost on a window, delicate branching lines that represented death advancing through living tissue. The skin felt wrong under his fingers when he examined it, crackling slightly like paper, a sensation that indicated gas bubbles forming beneath the surface. When James pressed gently near the wound, he could actually feel the gas moving under the skin, a sensation that made his stomach turn. This was not a simple infection that antibiotics could handle. This was gas gangrene, caused by bacteria that thrived in low-oxygen environments, particularly in muscle tissue damaged by trauma. Gas gangrene. James recognized it instantly from his training. The bacteria that caused it, usually Clostridium perfringens but sometimes other species in the same family, lived in soil everywhere, especially in agricultural areas that had been fertilized with manure. When these bacteria entered a wound, particularly a wound with crushed muscle tissue that had poor blood flow, they found an ideal environment. They produced toxins that destroyed surrounding tissue, creating more dead tissue, which gave them more territory to colonize. They produced gas as a byproduct of their metabolism, creating the characteristic crackling feeling under the skin, and they could spread with terrifying speed, sometimes advancing an inch or more per hour, turning healthy tissue into dead tissue that would need to be removed, assuming the patient lived long enough for removal to be possible. The standard treatment was aggressive surgical removal of all dead tissue, a procedure called debridement that essentially meant cutting away everything that looked infected until you reached tissue that still had good blood flow and thus good chance of survival. High doses of penicillin to overwhelm any bacteria that remained. Immediate evacuation to a hospital with proper facilities, including blood transfusion capabilities, because gangrene patients often developed shock and massive blood poisoning as the toxins spread through their systems. Sometimes, if the infection was advanced enough, amputation was the only option. Cut off the infected limb before the toxins reached vital organs. It was brutal, but it saved lives that would otherwise be lost. James had none of those options. The surgical supplies were limited to basic instruments, scalpels and forceps and scissors, that were intended for minor procedures, not extensive tissue removal. He could debride superficially, but without proper equipment and proper antibiotics to back up the surgery, aggressive debridement might do more harm than good. The penicillin had run out 2 days ago, with no resupply expected for at least a week, assuming the supply lines could even be re-established, which at this point seemed unlikely, and evacuation was impossible. The roads were either controlled by enemy forces or blocked by snow and abandoned vehicles. Several attempts to evacuate casualties during the first 2 days of the offensive had ended with ambulances being destroyed and their passengers killed. Command had ordered all non-emergency evacuation attempts to stop until the tactical situation improved. Thomas Miller looked up at him with eyes that already knew, eyes that had seen enough over 2 years of combat to recognize when a medic was seeing something bad. "It is bad, is not it, Doc?" James hated being called Doc. He was not a doctor, just a corporal with medical training, but the men in the unit had given him the nickname anyway, and it had stuck. "It is infected, Sergeant. I need to clean it again, remove some of the dead tissue, keep it from spreading. But you do not have medicine for it." There was no point in lying. "No, I do not have the medicine you need. Not the kind that would stop this for sure." Miller closed his eyes for a moment, absorbing that information. When he opened them again, his voice was remarkably steady. "How long do I have?" "Do not talk like that. We will figure something out." "Doc, I have been in this man's army long enough to know when someone is dodging the question." "How long?" James sat down on the edge of the cot, a breach of protocol, but a necessary moment of honesty between two men who understood the situation. "If the infection keeps spreading at this rate without antibiotics, maybe 3 days before it gets into your bloodstream, another 2 days after that, maybe less before the toxins shut down your organs. But Sergeant, supply could come through tomorrow. Evacuation could open up. The situation is fluid." "Fluid meaning we are getting our tails kicked and nobody knows what is happening." "That is one way to put it, yes." Miller managed a weak smile. "Always appreciated your honesty, Doc. Most medics try to feed you comforting lies. You just tell it straight." Seemed like the respectful thing to do. Treat grown men like grown men. "Well, I appreciate it. Now go figure something out, because I have got a wife and 2 kids back in Iowa, and I promised them I would come home, and I do not break promises to my family." James stood, his mind already racing. Miller was the first, but he would not be the last. In a cold environment with so many wounded, infections were inevitable. Without antibiotics, those infections would become epidemic. But as he moved through the aid station that morning, James found 5 more cases. Private Anthony Rodriguez had a hand wound turning the same gray-green color. Corporal David Chen's foot wound showed early signs. Technician 5th grade William Brooks, Private First Class Robert Hayes, and Private Eugene Cooper all had infections advancing faster than their bodies could fight them. By afternoon, James had counted 12 men showing symptoms of gas gangrene. By evening, the number had reached 19. They were going to die, all of them, unless something changed. Captain Richard Jameson, the white medical officer in charge of the aid station, was doing everything by regulation. He had sent urgent requests for supplies up the chain of command. He had rationed what little penicillin remained for the most severe cases. He had instructed the medics to debride wounds aggressively, cutting away dead tissue to slow the infection spread. But everyone in the station could do the math. 19 infected men, perhaps a dozen more by tomorrow. No supplies, no evacuation, no options. That night, James lay in his bedroll, unable to sleep despite exhaustion that went bone deep. The aid station occupied an abandoned barn, its walls drafty and cold, filled with the sounds of wounded men trying not to cry out in pain because they knew their suffering made things harder for everyone else. Some succeeded in staying silent. Others could not, and their muffled sobs and groans created a soundtrack of misery that never quite stopped day or night. The temperature inside was barely above freezing, despite the small heating stove someone had rigged up in one corner. James could see his breath in the darkness, white clouds that dissipated slowly in the still air. He kept thinking about Thomas Miller, about the way the sergeant had looked at him, trusting that somehow the medic would find a solution, trusting that the army would not just abandon him to die from an infection that could have been easily treated under normal circumstances. But these were not normal circumstances. Nothing about the situation was normal. They were trapped, cut off, running out of everything, and more casualties kept arriving every few hours as the situation deteriorated. His mind drifted back to Alabama, to his grandfather's porch, to that summer day in 1933 when he had watched Samuel Washington save Thomas Jenkins's life with what white doctors would have called superstition. White lightning, crushed herbs, pine resin. It had worked on a farm boy's infected leg. Could it work here in Belgium, on shrapnel wounds and gas gangrene? The conditions were different, certainly. The bacteria might be different species. The extent of tissue damage was probably worse than anything his grandfather had ever treated. But the fundamental problem was the same. Infection-eating tissue spreading toward vital areas, threatening to kill if not stopped. The idea was insane. Everything in his military medical training screamed against it. Alcohol was not a substitute for antibiotics. Folk remedies had no place in combat medicine, especially not remedies that came from an uneducated black man born into slavery. If he tried something so unorthodox and it failed, men would die, and the blame would fall entirely on him. The army would not care that he had tried his best with limited resources. They would only care that he had deviated from proper procedures, that he had essentially experimented on human subjects without authorization, that he had allowed personal beliefs to override scientific training. Worse, if he tried it and succeeded, he would still face court-martial for deviating from proper medical procedures. A black medic using illegal alcohol to treat white soldiers. The army would crucify him. At best, he would be dishonorably discharged. At worst, he would spend years in military prison. And even if they decided to be lenient, his dream of becoming a doctor would be finished. No medical school would accept someone who had been court-martialed for medical malpractice, even if that malpractice had saved lives. But if he did nothing, those 19 men would definitely die, probably more as new cases developed. James lay there in the darkness, wrestling with a decision that had no good options. Follow procedure, watch men die, but keep his conscience and his future clear. Or violate every rule, risk everything, gamble on a remedy he had seen work once on one person under completely different circumstances. The decision crystallized around 3 in the morning when he heard Miller crying out in pain in his sleep. fever dreams making him call for his wife, for his children, for someone to help him. James sat up, making a choice that terrified and energized him in equal measure. He would try. He had to try. Because watching men die when he might, just possibly, have a way to save them, was not something he could live with. If it failed, if he faced court-martial, if his life was destroyed, at least he would know he had tried everything. At least he would not spend the rest of his life wondering if his grandfather's remedy might have worked, if he had just had the courage to attempt it. He needed 3 things. First, alcohol, high-proof and pure enough to serve as an effective antiseptic. Second, medicinal herbs that could reduce inflammation and fight infection. Third, something to seal and protect the wounds while still allowing some air circulation. In Alabama, his grandfather had used pine resin. Here in the Ardennes forest, pine trees were everywhere, their dark silhouettes visible through the barn's cracks, standing in silent ranks like soldiers themselves. The alcohol proved easier to find than expected. Every military unit had soldiers who knew how to locate or create liquor, despite regulations against it. Men under stress found ways to cope, and alcohol had been a coping mechanism for soldiers since the beginning of organized warfare. James approached Corporal Vincent Romano, an Italian-American from New Jersey, who had a reputation for always knowing where to find a drink. Vincent was 24, a small, wiry man with quick hands and quicker wit, the kind of soldier who could scrounge anything if given enough time and cigarettes to trade. James found him on watch duty at the barn's entrance, stamping his feet to keep blood flowing in the cold. "Romano, I need to ask you something, and I need you to keep it between us." Vincent turned, his breath forming clouds in the frigid air. "What do you need, Doc? If it is medical supplies, you know I do not have any connections there." "Not medical supplies. Alcohol. High proof, pure as possible, at least a liter, maybe 2. Vincent initially thought James was joking. His face went through a comical progression of expressions, confusion, realization, then something close to delight. "You want shine? Here? Doc, we are in the middle of nowhere getting pounded by the German forces, freezing our tails off, and you want to throw a party? It is not for drinking. I need it for medical use." Medical use? Vincent's tone made it clear he did not believe that for a second. "Right, medical use. Doc, if you want a drink to take the edge off, nobody would blame you. Just say that. Do not insult my intelligence with medical use." James grabbed Vincent's arm, his voice low and urgent. "I'm serious, Romano. I need high-proof alcohol to treat those gangrene cases. Without it, they are all going to die. With it, I might be able to save some of them. Maybe all of them. But I need pure alcohol, strong enough to kill bacteria on contact." Vincent stared at him, his expression changing as he realized James was completely serious. "You are talking about using moonshine as medicine? My grandfather used it to save a man's life when I was 12. I watched him do it. It worked. Your grandfather, no offense, was probably treating a regular infection, not gas gangrene. And he probably had access to better conditions than we have here. You are right on both counts. But Romano, we have nothing else. No penicillin, no sulfur drugs, no way to evacuate these men. If I do nothing, they die for certain. If I try this, at least there is a chance." Vincent looked at him for a long moment, then nodded slowly. "My uncle makes grappa back home in New Jersey. Good stuff, strong enough to strip paint, about 90 proof or higher. There is a Belgian farmer about 2 kilometers from here. Old guy named Dubois who stayed when everyone else evacuated. Word is he has been making something similar in his barn for 50 years. Eau de vie, they call it, water of life. Sells it to whoever has cigarettes to trade. I've bought from him twice since we got here. Can you get to him? In this weather, with enemy patrols everywhere." "Doc, that is crazy. They control half the forest at this point. One wrong turn and I walk into a machine gun position. So is watching 19 good men die from infections when we might be able to stop it. Romano, I would not ask if there was any other option." Vincent thought about it, weighing the risks, then sighed. "Give me 2 hours. I know a route that stays in heavy trees most of the way. Should provide cover. If I am not back by dawn, assume I ran into trouble." "Thank you. Do not thank me yet. If this gets us both court-martialed, I am going to haunt you." He checked his rifle, pulled his collar up against the cold and disappeared into the darkness. While Vincent went on his dangerous errand, James searched for herbs. The Ardennes winter had killed most plant life, but he remembered that certain species remained potent even when dormant. He found wild garlic growing near a stream, its bulbs strong-smelling and perfect for fighting infection. He located winter savory, a hardy herb that his grandfather had sworn reduced swelling. He dug through frozen ground to find burdock root, known for drawing out toxins. The pine resin was everywhere, but it needed to be prepared correctly. James gathered chunks of hardened sap from several trees, then spent an hour boiling it over a small fire behind the barn, rendering it down into a thick, sticky substance that would remain pliable when mixed with other ingredients. Vincent returned after 3 hours, not 2, carrying a clay jug that sloshed with clear liquid. "Nearly got shot by a patrol," he said, breathing hard. "But I got 2 liters of what that Belgian farmer calls eau de vie, water of life. He says it is 90 proof, maybe higher, strong enough to run a jeep if you are desperate." James took the jug carefully, removed the cork, and sniffed. The fumes made his eyes water. It was perfect. He worked through the night, creating the mixture exactly as his grandfather had taught him. The alcohol formed the base, killing bacteria on contact. He crushed the garlic, winter savory, and burdock root, extracting their oils and compounds through careful grinding. The pine resin, still warm from boiling, mixed with the alcohol and herbs to create a thick paste that would adhere to wounds while allowing some air circulation. The result looked like nothing in any medical textbook. It was dark green, smelled strongly of garlic and pine, and had a consistency somewhere between honey and tar. James stared at the bowl of mixture, knowing that what happened next would determine everything. He had to test it first. Using it on a human patient without any trial was too risky, but he had no laboratory, no time, no way to conduct proper experiments. Then he remembered Corporal Hayes's leg wound, the one that had already been written off as too far gone to save. Hayes would lose the leg in any case, assuming he lived long enough for evacuation. If the mixture failed there, it would cause no additional harm. James approached Hayes's cot as dawnlight began filtering through the barn's cracks. The corporal was semi-conscious, fever having claimed his awareness. The wound on his lower leg had progressed beyond what anyone thought survivable, flesh turning black, the smell of rot overwhelming. "I am sorry," James whispered, knowing Hayes could not hear, "but this is all I have got." He cleaned the wound as thoroughly as possible with regular alcohol, removed what dead tissue he could with limited instruments, then applied the homemade mixture generously, covering every surface of the infected area. He wrapped it with clean bandages and moved on to the next patient. Thomas Miller was awake when James reached him. The sergeant watched the unusual preparation being applied to his leg wound with obvious skepticism. "Doc, what exactly is that stuff?" "Something my grandfather taught me. Alcohol to kill the infection, herbs to reduce swelling, resin to protect the wound. Smells like a Christmas tree got into a fight with an onion." "That is probably accurate." "Is it going to work?" James met his eyes. "I honestly do not know, Sergeant, but it is what we have got." He treated all 19 infected men that morning, using every bit of the mixture he had created. Captain Jameson found him finishing the last application and stopped dead in the doorway. "Corporal Washington, what in God's name is that smell?" James stood at attention, still holding the bowl of mixture. "Sir, I have applied a topical treatment to the gangrene cases." "A topical treatment? What treatment?" "That is not in our supplies." "No, sir. It is something I formulated from available materials." Jameson's face went through several shades of red. "You formulated something? Corporal, you are a medic, not a chemist. What exactly is in that concoction?" James explained, leaving out only the illegal origin of the alcohol. Jameson listened with an expression of growing horror. "You are telling me you applied an untested folk remedy to 19 critically wounded soldiers, using alcohol of unknown purity, herbs you dug up outside, and tree sap. Corporal, do you have any idea what you have done? If those men die because of some voodoo medicine, you will face a court-martial. I should relieve you of duty right now." "Sir, respectfully, those men were already dying. We have no penicillin, no surgical facilities, no way to evacuate them. Standard procedures are not working because we do not have the supplies to follow standard procedures. I had to try something. You had to follow proper protocol and document that we did everything regulation allowed. Now if they die, it will look like we poisoned them with moonshine and plant matter." James said nothing. There was nothing to say. Jameson was right about the risk, about the potential consequences, but James had made his choice. "Keep them under observation," Jameson finally said, his voice tight with anger and fear. "Document everything, and pray to whatever God you believe in that this insane experiment does not kill them all." The first 24 hours were agony. James checked the wounds every 2 hours, looking for any sign of improvement or catastrophic failure. Some of the men ran high fevers. Others complained that the mixture burned in their wounds. One soldier, Private Rodriguez, had an allergic reaction to something in the herbs that made his arm swell, though it subsided after a few hours. But on the morning of December 18th, exactly 2 days after the first application, James unwrapped Thomas Miller's bandage and saw something that made his hands shake. The grey-green color had stopped spreading. The flesh at the edges of the wound looked pinker, healthier. The smell, while still unpleasant, had changed from rot to something more like medicine. "How does it look, Doc?" Miller asked. James had to clear his throat before speaking. "Better. It looks better." He moved through the other 18 cases with growing excitement. 16 of them showed similar improvement. The infections had not disappeared, but they had stopped advancing, giving the men's immune systems a chance to fight back. 2 cases, including Corporal Hayes with the most severe infection, showed no change, but they were not getting worse either. By December 20th, 4 days after the initial treatment, the results were undeniable. 12 of the 19 infected men showed dramatic improvement, with healthy tissue beginning to grow around their wounds. 5 more showed moderate improvement, infections contained if not eliminated. Only 2 remained critical, and even they had stabilized rather than deteriorating further. Captain Jameson examined the patients with an expression James could not quite read. The medical officer checked each wound carefully, studied the healing process, and finally turned to James with something that might have been respect. "I do not understand how this is working, Corporal. Everything in my training says it should not. But the evidence is undeniable. Whatever you made, it is effective. My grandfather would say it is just common sense, sir. Use what works, even if you do not understand why. Your grandfather was clearly a remarkable man, but Washington, we cannot stop with these 19. I counted this morning. We have 31 new cases showing early symptoms of gangrene, more arriving every hour. The German offensive is pushing more casualties our way, and we still have no resupply of proper antibiotics." James felt his stomach drop. 31 more cases. He had used all the mixture on the first 19. He would need to make more, much more. "Sir, I will need help gathering materials." "You will have it. I am assigning 4 men to assist you. Whatever you need, wherever you need to go, they will help you get it. And Washington, I am putting in my report that you developed an effective field expedient treatment for gas gangrene under combat conditions. What you did was unorthodox as hell, but it saved lives. That is what matters." Over the next week, James and his assistants became scavengers and amateur chemists. Vincent Romano made 3 more dangerous trips to the Belgian farmer, trading cigarettes, chocolate, and eventually a broken watch for jugs of high-proof alcohol. They stripped pine resin from every tree within safe walking distance. They dug up herbs from frozen ground, identified plants through trial and error, learned which combinations worked best for different types of infections. The mixture evolved. James discovered that adding crushed willow bark helped with pain and fever. Yarrow, which he found growing in a protected area near a stone wall, seemed to speed healing. He learned to adjust the ratio of resin to alcohol based on the wound's location, making it thinner for areas that needed flexibility, thicker for areas needing maximum protection. By December 27th, James had treated 73 soldiers for various stages of gas gangrene and other serious infections. 68 showed significant improvement. 3 had been stable enough to evacuate when supply lines temporarily reopened. 2 had died, but from complications unrelated to the treatment, their injuries simply too severe to survive regardless of what medicine they received. Word spread beyond James's aid station. Medics from other units began hearing about the Black Corporal, who was saving lives with some kind of improvised medicine. A few came to observe, skeptical at first, then amazed as they saw the results. James taught them how to make the mixture, carefully explaining each ingredient and its purpose, demonstrating the proper ratio and application technique. Staff Sergeant Donald Patterson from Ohio spent 2 days learning the process, then brought the knowledge back to his unit 10 kilometers away. Technician 4th grade Samuel Cohen, a medic with the 1st Infantry Division, memorized the recipe and began producing it for his casualties. Within 3 weeks, variations of James Washington's mixture were being used in a dozen aid stations across the Ardennes sector. On January 5, 1945, a supply convoy finally broke through with proper medical supplies. Penicillin, sulfur drugs, surgical equipment, everything that had been desperately needed for 3 weeks arrived in abundance. Captain Jameson inventoried the supplies with obvious relief. "Thank God," he said to James, "we can finally practice real medicine again." But something unexpected happened. As the medics began transitioning patients back to regulation treatments, some of the men requested to continue with James's mixture. Private First Class Michael O'Brien, whose hand wound had healed remarkably well under the improvised treatment, refused the penicillin injection. "Doc Washington's stuff worked," he said stubbornly. "Why change now?" James had to explain that proper antibiotics were more effective, more reliable, tested and proven through scientific research. But privately, he understood O'Brien's trust. The mixture had saved him when regulation medicine was unavailable. That created a bond, a belief in something that had worked when everything else had failed. The final count, documented in Captain Jameson's reports, was staggering. Between December 16th and January 10th, James Washington and the medics he trained treated 118 soldiers for gas gangrene and severe infections using the improvised mixture. 96 recovered fully. 14 recovered with permanent damage that would have occurred regardless of treatment. 8 died, but 6 of those deaths were attributed to wounds or complications unrelated to the infection. In comparison, the expected survival rate for gas gangrene in field conditions without proper antibiotics was less than 30%. James's mixture had achieved an 81% survival rate under the worst possible circumstances. But there was a problem. What James had done violated numerous military regulations. He had used unregistered substances on human patients. He had deviated from established medical protocols. He had employed a treatment with no scientific testing or approval. The alcohol alone was enough to trigger an investigation, given its illegal origins and the military's strict prohibition on alcohol use in combat zones. Captain Jameson understood the precarious situation. In late January, he called James into his makeshift office. "Washington, I have been wrestling with how to report what happened here. On one hand, you saved at least 40 lives, probably more if we count the indirect effects of your training other medics. On the other hand, you broke about 17 different regulations doing it. If the wrong person sees the full details, you will spend the rest of the war in a military prison." James nodded slowly. He had known this conversation was coming. "I understand, sir. So here is what I am going to do. My official report will state that you developed a field-expedient antiseptic treatment using locally available materials, that you showed exceptional initiative under combat conditions, and that your actions directly saved numerous lives. I will not mention the alcohol source. I will not emphasize how unorthodox the treatment was. And I'm going to recommend you for a commendation. Sir, you do not have to do that." "Yes, I do. Because what you did was remarkable, even if it scared the hell out of me. You saw men dying. You remembered something your grandfather taught you, and you had the courage to try it when everyone else, including me, had given up. That is the definition of heroism, Washington. The fact that it involved moonshine and pine tar does not change that." The commendation never came through official channels. The Army, in its infinite bureaucracy, lost the paperwork somewhere between Belgium and headquarters. James Washington finished the war with the same rank he started with, corporal, and no medals beyond the standard campaign ribbons everyone received. But something else happened that mattered more. In February of 1945, a medical researcher with the Army Medical Corps named Major Richard Feldman arrived at the aid station to investigate reports of the improvised treatment. Feldman was Jewish from New York, with advanced degrees in biochemistry and battlefield medicine. He spent 3 days interviewing James, examining patients, analyzing samples of the mixture. "This is fascinating," Feldman said, peering at the mixture through a portable microscope. "The alcohol provides immediate bactericidal action. The garlic contains allicin, a natural antibiotic compound. The pine resin has antimicrobial properties that were documented in ancient Greek medicine, but dismissed by modern practice. The combination creates a hostile environment for bacteria while promoting healing. It is crude, certainly, but the underlying principles are sound." "So it is not just luck?" James asked. "Oh, there was some luck involved. You could have easily created something toxic or ineffective. But mostly, this is the result of empirical knowledge passed down through generations, combined with your own medical training and willingness to synthesize different approaches. Your grandfather understood infection control at a practical level, even without formal education. You applied that understanding in a combat situation. That is not voodoo, Washington. That is medicine." Feldman wrote a detailed report on James's treatment, including chemical analyses of the components and recommendations for further research. He argued that traditional remedies deserved scientific investigation rather than dismissal, that practical folk medicine often contained valuable knowledge waiting to be understood through modern science. The report generated exactly zero interest from the military establishment. It was filed away, forgotten in the chaos of the war's final months. But years later, in 1952, Feldman published a civilian paper on battlefield medicine that included a section on improvised treatments. He cited James Washington's work in the Ardennes, describing it as an example of innovative medical thinking under extreme conditions. That paper caught the attention of a young researcher named Robert Wilson, who was studying the antimicrobial properties of natural compounds. Wilson tracked down James Washington, by then working as a biology teacher in Tuskegee, and asked to interview him about his wartime experience. The conversation lasted 6 hours, covering everything from his grandfather's remedies to the specific conditions in the Ardennes to the exact composition of the mixture. "Do you realize," Wilson said at the end, "that what you created was essentially a broad-spectrum topical antibiotic before we had fully developed such things? The commercial versions of topical antibiotics with similar ingredients did not hit the market until the mid-1950s. You were a decade ahead." James smiled. "My grandfather was ahead by a lot more than that. He was using these remedies in the 1880s. Traditional knowledge often contains more wisdom than we give it credit for. The tragedy is how much of it gets lost or ignored because it does not fit our preconceptions about who can generate medical knowledge." The men James saved went on to live full lives. Thomas Miller returned to Iowa, married his sweetheart, raised 4 children, and worked 30 years as a postal carrier. He told everyone who would listen about the black medic who saved his leg with homemade medicine when the army had nothing to offer. Private Anthony Rodriguez became a teacher in Texas, and he insisted on including a unit about combat medics in his history classes, always mentioning James Washington by name. Staff Sergeant Donald Patterson, the medic who learned James's technique and brought it to his own unit, kept in touch with James for 40 years. In letters exchanged over the decades, Patterson estimated that he personally treated at least 30 soldiers using variations of the mixture, with similar success rates. He credited James with teaching him the most important lesson of his medical career, that ingenuity and compassion mattered more than regulation when lives were at stake. James Washington himself never claimed to have done anything extraordinary. When asked about the Ardennes in later years, he would say simply that he used what he had learned at home to help where he could. He credited his grandfather, Samuel Washington, as the true hero of the story, the man who had preserved knowledge through hard times and passed it on with the hope that it might someday save lives. In 1968, when James's grandson asked him why the army never officially recognized what he had done, the old man thought carefully before answering. "The military has rules for good reasons," he said. "Without rules and standards, medicine would be chaos, and more people would die from mistakes than from proper procedure. What I did worked, but it could have gone wrong in 100 different ways. If it had failed, Those rules would have been there to protect the next group of soldiers from another medic trying something dangerous. But it did not fail, Grandpa. You saved 40 people. I saved 40 people, yes. But I also took a terrible risk, and I was lucky it paid off. The real lesson is not that rules should be broken. It is that when you are in an impossible situation, when people will die if you do nothing, then you have to make the best choice you can with what you have. You use your training, your knowledge, and whatever wisdom has been passed down to you. Then you hope and you work, and you do everything in your power to help. Did you ever regret it, even when you thought you might be court-martialed? James smiled. Not for 1 second. Those men deserved every chance at life. If giving them that chance meant ending my career or going to prison, that was a price worth paying. You do not measure the value of a life by the convenience of saving it. That philosophy guided James Washington through his entire career. After the war, he completed his education on the GI Bill, earning a bachelor's degree in biology and a master's degree in education. He spent 33 years teaching science at Tuskegee Institute, influencing thousands of students with his combination of rigorous scientific thinking and respect for traditional knowledge. He often told his students about the Ardennes, not to glorify his own actions but to illustrate broader principles. Science was not just about laboratories and textbooks. It was about observation, hypothesis, and testing. His grandfather had been a scientist in the truest sense, observing what worked, refining techniques through trial and error, passing on knowledge that could be verified through results. The fact that Samuel Washington had no formal education did not make his understanding less valid. James also taught his students about the importance of courage in medicine. At some point in their careers, he said, they would face situations where the textbook answer was not available, where they would have to make decisions with incomplete information and lives hanging in the balance. In those moments, they would need to draw on every source of knowledge available, from formal training to family wisdom to their own analytical thinking. And they would need the courage to act even when the safe choice was to do nothing. In 1989, the Department of Veterans Affairs conducted a research project on medical innovations during World War II. A historian working on the project discovered Captain Jameson's reports about the aid station in the Ardennes and the improvised gangrene treatment. The historian tracked down surviving soldiers who had been treated with the mixture, interviewing them about their experiences. Their testimonies were remarkably consistent. They remembered a young black medic who had refused to give up on them when they were dying. They remembered a mixture that smelled terrible, but worked when nothing else was available. They remembered being told years later that what James Washington had done was technically against regulations, and not caring one bit because they were alive to hear about it. The historian, a woman named Dr. Elizabeth Morrison, eventually located James Washington in Tuskegee. He was 87 years old, still sharp-minded, living in the house where he had grown up. She spent a week interviewing him, recording his memories, documenting every detail of how he had developed and applied the treatment. "Why do you think this story has been largely forgotten?" Morrison asked near the end of her visit. James considered the question. "Several reasons, I suppose. First, I was not an officer or a doctor, just a corporal medic. Enlisted men do not usually get written into the history books. Second, I was black, treating mostly white soldiers at a time when the military was still segregated. That made people uncomfortable in different ways. Third, what I did was irregular, outside the system, hard to fit into official narratives about military medicine. And fourth, it happened during one of the biggest battles of the war. There were a lot of stories from the Ardennes, most of them more dramatic than a medic mixing up folk remedies in a barn. But your story saved 40+ lives. That is dramatic. Dramatic to the people who lived, certainly. But history tends to focus on the big gestures, the generals and battles and turning points. The small acts of desperation that kept individuals alive do not make it into the textbooks. I made peace with that a long time ago. What if I told you I think this story deserves to be better known? That it represents something important about innovation, about the value of diverse knowledge traditions, about courage under impossible circumstances?" James smiled. "Then I would say you should write whatever you think is important, Dr. Morrison. Just make sure you mention my grandfather. Samuel Washington was the real innovator. I just remembered what he taught me and hoped it would work in Belgium the same way it had worked in Alabama. Dr. Morrison published her research in 1991 in a medical history journal with limited circulation, but the story found its audience. It was picked up by other researchers interested in folk medicine, in African American contributions to military history, in the social history of World War II. Slowly, over the course of a decade, James Washington's name began appearing in books and articles about combat medicine, about medical innovation, about the often overlooked contributions of black soldiers to the war effort. In 2003, 14 years after the initial research, and 9 years after James Washington's death at the age of 92, the Army Medical Corps formally recognized his contributions with a posthumous commendation. The citation praised his exceptional initiative, his medical knowledge, and his courage in developing an effective treatment under combat conditions. It was attached to his military record, ensuring that future researchers would find his story. At the ceremony where the commendation was presented to James's family, a retired colonel named Marcus Thompson spoke about the broader significance of what James had done. Thompson, himself a combat medic who had served in Vietnam, talked about how James's story had influenced his own career. "When I was a young medic in training," Thompson said, "an instructor told me about a corporal in World War II who saved lives using moonshine and pine sap when proper medicine was not available. He told us that story to illustrate the most important principle of combat medicine. Your job is not to follow regulations perfectly. Your job is to keep people alive using whatever means necessary, within the bounds of your conscience and your oath to do no harm." James Washington understood that. He saw men dying. He remembered a remedy from his childhood, and he had the courage to try something unorthodox when the orthodox approach had nothing to offer. That is what we should all aspire to. The family donated James's personal papers, including his war diary and his grandfather's handwritten notes on remedies, to the National Museum of African American History and Culture. They sit in the archives now, available to researchers, a record of knowledge that traveled from slavery through Jim Crow to a frozen barn in Belgium, and saved the lives of men who might never have known the name of their healer. The medical mixture itself is now understood in scientific terms. Modern analysis has confirmed what James intuited and what his grandfather knew through experience. High-proof alcohol is an effective topical bactericide. Allicin from garlic has proven antimicrobial properties. Pine resin contains compounds that inhibit bacterial growth and promote tissue healing. The combination, while crude by modern standards, created an environment where infections could not thrive and healing could begin. Several pharmaceutical companies have developed modern versions of similar treatments, properly tested and standardized, used in situations where conventional antibiotics are ineffective or unavailable. None of them acknowledge James Washington or Samuel Washington as inspirations, but the underlying principles remain the same, using natural antimicrobial compounds in combination to fight infection at the wound site. The broader lesson of James Washington's story resonates far beyond the specifics of his mixture. It speaks to the value of traditional knowledge, the importance of listening to diverse voices in science and medicine, the need for flexibility in crisis situations, and the courage required to deviate from established norms when circumstances demand it. James often said that he was not a hero, just a man who did what needed doing with the tools he had available. But heroism often looks exactly like that: ordinary people making extraordinary decisions in desperate moments, drawing on whatever knowledge and courage they possess, acting to help others when the easy choice would be to turn away. In the frozen barn in the Ardennes forest, in December of 1944, a young black medic chose not to turn away. He remembered his grandfather's wisdom, trusted his own training and judgment, and created something that should not have worked, but did. 40 men went home to their families because of that choice. Thousands of their descendants exist because James Washington had the courage to try when everyone else, including himself, thought the situation was hopeless. That is the power of knowledge passed down through generations, of wisdom earned through experience, of compassion that refuses to accept defeat. It is the power of seeing every life as worthy of every effort, regardless of regulations, regardless of risk, regardless of whether anyone will ever know or care what you attempted. James Washington saw that power in his grandfather's hands on an Alabama farm in the summer of 1933. He carried it across an ocean, through a war, into a desperate situation where men were dying and hope was scarce. And in applying what he had learned from an uneducated black man born into slavery, James Washington demonstrated that medicine is not just about science, it is about humanity, about the determination to heal, about the refusal to let good people die when you might, just possibly, have a way to save them. The mixture he created has been analyzed and replicated. The lives he saved have been documented and counted. But the true measure of what James Washington accomplished cannot be found in scientific papers or military records. It can only be found in the descendants of those 40 soldiers, in the children and grandchildren and great-grandchildren who exist, because one medic remembered his grandfather's remedies and had the courage to use them. That is a legacy that transcends any commendation, any recognition, any official acknowledgement. It is the legacy of life itself, passed forward through generations, made possible by knowledge and courage and the simple, profound belief that every person deserves a chance to survive, to heal, to go home and live the life they were meant to live. And that concludes our story. If you made it this far, please share your thoughts in the comments. What part of this historical account surprised you most? Do not forget to subscribe for more untold stories from World War II, and check out the video on screen for another incredible tale from history. Until next time.